Well, in the continuation of the reminiscing of the life of myself, Irvin Cumming, we shall be continuing on this, the second tape. We were in Boston at the Boston airport to purchase an aircraft, and as I mentioned before, there was a J4 Travel-Air that I was somewhat interested in. It was $1,000, I think it was. But it was over to Muller Field. And Crocker Snow called up Muller Field and asked the pilot over there if he'd bring it over, that he had somebody interested in buying it. So they come over with it. And he landed at the airport there. And I get in, he's going to fly back to Muller Field, of course, which is just only 4 or 5 miles away. So I get in the front seat. He didn't give me any duel or anything, and we flew back to Muller Field. And in the course of conversation, I seen that he had a little Dallas Aircraft Aviation School pin on there, and I mentioned to him about that, and he said yes, he went to Dallas Aviation School, and he was flying there at Muller Field, and his name was Shavs. Well, later on, of course, he joined the Boston Maine Airways after I did. That is, he joined as a pilot. I was still an agent up in Holton. And we flew with him and become very good friends and well acquainted. So we had a short conversation there at the airport. And he told me roughly how the aircraft handled and so forth. I never flew an airplane with brakes before. I had foot brakes. We always had tail skid on it. And I never flew anything higher than 110 horsepower. That's what those Warners were and Kinners that we was flying down in Texas. And this was a 210 horsepower job. Well, I got in that aircraft, taxied down to the end of the runway, wiggling all around as I went. I'd over control on one brake and then on the other and one thing or other. Never having used brakes before, always using the rudder to steer with on the ground. Well, anyway, I get down to the end of the field and turn around, and I gave her the gun. Well, I no more sooner swallowed than I was in the air and up 1,000 feet. Well, I'm telling you, I thought I was on the end of a rocket. And it was only 4 or 5 miles from the airport. Jiminy Christmas, I was up there and I was looking down at Boston Airport. I could hardly see it. So I started pulling back the power and coming in for a landing there. And I think I made one 360 before I come in there. Of course, there wasn't too much traffic then. Curtis Wright had a school there at that time, too. They were just about closed up, though. And I come in and over the water, and I settled in on the edge of the grass, on the cinder strip there, and I struck once. And I gave a nice big bounce about 40 feet high and flew along till about middle of the field, and I struck again. And this time, of course, from then on, the bounces got smaller and quicker between times, and each time I'd put the brakes on a little bit, the tail would come up some, and we come to a grinding halt anyway before we run into the bay on the other side. We was landing to the west, and that was my experience. Well, I didn't care too much for the aircraft, really, because, well, it just didn't seem to have what I wanted. And there was another airplane there that looked pretty good to me. It was a Challenger Travel-Air. So I asked him about that, and he said, yeah, that was for sale. It just come in from Curtis Wright from Hartford. And there was $1,000 on that, or if I wanted to give them an extra $200, they'd change the engine and put a brand new Challenger in there, 185 horsepower Challenger. Well, I did that. I had just about enough money to do that from Father, of course. And incidentally, I might say the banks closed right about that time. That is when Franklin Roosevelt got in there after election and so forth. He closed all the banks. And Raymond, for some reason or other, got wind of that. And he told Father about it, so that Father was able to transfer some of his money into the checking account. But this money, had he left it in the bank, it was quite likely that he would have lost it, or a goodly portion of it. So in the long run, it really didn't cost him anything as far as the aircraft was concerned. Otherwise, he would have been out of it in the bank anyway. So we decided to purchase this aircraft. They changed the engine and put in a brand new engine, and then of course I wanted a little time in it just to go around the field, make a few landings. And there was a pilot there that took me up, and we rode around. I made 2 or 3 landings. Had no brakes, of course, just a tail skid. And it was a heavy airplane, and it was a noisy one too, but it was a nice one. And the pilot that checked me out was Frank Kendall. And strange as it may seem, we got talking about that later on when I got hired by Northeast Airlines, or Boston Main Airways, I guess it was at that time. And I asked Frank about this. We got talking about it, and Frank remembered it very, very well. And he said that airplane was quite a mix-up on that. He said after you left and paid for it, he said that aircraft had come from Curtiss Wright Company from Hartford, Connecticut. And Curtiss Wright was going through bankruptcy at that time. Of course, that was right in the middle of the Depression. And they brought that aircraft up to Boston, and they had a price of, I think he said, $6,500, $6,500 on it. And of course, that would have been a way, way out of reach. But for some reason, I don't know how or what, they got mixed up on their numbers and the bookwork some way. And we got that aircraft for $1,200. And everybody that saw that ship as I come up through Maine, going to Holton and flying around later, and heard the story on it, they all said, boy, you sure got a steal on that. I don't know how you ever got that aircraft for that amount of money. So that's the story on that old Challenger Travel Air, how we happened to get it. So the next morning, we went back to that afternoon, I went back to the hotel, a Manger Hotel. I stayed over at the Manger, and that was a hotel right over the old North Station, where all the trains come in and so forth. You get a nice room there then for $2, $2.50, and I got my charts and maps out and so forth, and figured a course up to Portland and up into Holton, and made my estimates and dead reckoning and so forth, all ready to get going the next morning. The only problem was, when I get out, that compass was never any good in that Travel Air, and I never did get a good compass in it, and it was pointing west when I was flying northeast, so I really couldn't depend on it. But we took off the next morning anyway. Nice day, beautiful day, and good wind blowing and so forth. And I climbed on up. I was going to fly at 1,500 feet. But before I knew it, I was up around 3,000 feet, and I could see pretty near to Holton. But I see so far I didn't know where I was, to tell you the truth. And I kept looking down, following the seacoast, and pretty soon I come down over a city, and at that time, you know, they wrote the name of the city on top of one of the big buildings they would paint it in. And it happened to be Saco, Biddeford. Well, I knew where that was, just a little bit south of Old Orchard. And Scarborough Airport, that was the old Portland Airport, was out at Scarborough. So I just glanced up the line there a little bit and flew right up into Old Orchard, and sure enough, I found the airport, and I flew around it twice to make sure I was going to be okay, and then I proceeded to land. Well, I pretty near run out of runway. There wasn't a runway, it was grass strip. I pretty near run into the bushes. Boy, I was going like the wind, you know, and of course there's no brakes on it. Well, come find out, I landed downwind. I thought I was going to land in the wind, but for some reason or other I got twisted up, and I landed downwind. So, oh boy, I taxied back into the hangar, talked with the boys, I guess, and for a little while, and then I took off and thought I'd fly on up the road to Bangor, probably. Well, I got up, followed the river, Kennebec River, up to Augusta, and I knew the airport at Waterville was in pretty good shape, so decided I'd land there, mainly because I could see some clouds building up over toward Bangor, and a few thunder showers was beginning to develop, but this was in the first part of the afternoon now. So I landed there, and they had a road. I landed to the west, and they had a road going right straight across the middle of that field. And I thought to myself, being pretty smart, I says, now there's going to be a ditch on that road, so I just want to clear that road and land right there so that I won't strike that ditch. And this I did, but I didn't have enough runway, and I went like the Maritimes H right into the bushes. Just about the length of the aircraft, the tail come up and settled back down, and people come down from the hangar, some of the mechanics, and we had to get a hold of it and pull it out of the briar patch there. There wasn't any damage done, with the exceptions of one primer line on one of the top cylinders was torn off, ripped off. So we took it up there and they soldered that on and so forth. And I got a cup of coffee there at the restaurant, I guess, and a sandwich, and decided I'd continue on. So I took off again, headed toward Bangor, but by this time there was really some clouds there. Of course, I only had 50 hours, and where I'd been flying was a great big field there in Texas. No problem to land at all. You could land and take off just like landing on a lake, you know. And I wasn't used to the small fields. But anyway, I couldn't get to Bangor. I wanted to pick up the Penobscot River. So I kept moving north, and I was just guessing where north was, of course, you know. And then I would turn and fly east, and I did come onto the river. And I come onto it by Howland, right around Howland or Lincoln there. Flew on up the Mattawamkeag and picked up Route 2, and I went up toward Island Falls. And I followed that road, looking right at it, until I got to Aunt Lizzie's, and I recognized her place all right. And I thought, well, by George, I'm going to sit down here for the night. And I'll go on over there tomorrow morning. Only 15 minutes across there to Halton. And I don't know why I decided to land there, but I did anyway. Little small darn field right alongside of a cemetery, too. And, of course, Aunt Lizzie and Grandma Jordan was there, and Alvin, one of Lizzie's boys, and Grandpa Jordan, too. Let me see. No, Grandpa was dead. He died in 28. That's right. He was dead. So I went in, stayed all night, and asked Grandma if she'd like to ride to Halton with me. She said, sure. So by golly, I took off the next morning to show her how safe it was and make a trip around the field. Just cleared the wires and taken out and come back in and landed. And she only had one leg, of course. She had one cut off. And I had to lift her in. I was pretty able then, boy, I'm telling you. From working on the line crew with the water company and climbing poles and everything, lifting her wasn't any more a problem than lifting a feather for me. I lifted her up and got her in the front seat, put a helmet and goggles on her and so forth. When I stepped back, you could just see the top of her head. There's no way possible she could see the ground from looking out there. The top of her head come to the top of the sides of the aircraft. Well, we get in, and meanwhile, we'd called home. Told them we was coming along, and etc. So we flew over and around the town and come out, and my field that I had hired before we bought the aircraft and so forth was Bob Peabody's out in Carey's Mills. And landed there. It was a nice field. It was a hay field, of course. And Grandma was 80 years old at that time. And now let me see. No, she was 84. Because she was 90 when she died, and she died in 38, right when Dick was born. And this was 32, of course. So she was 84 years old, was my first passenger. Well, this field that I rented from Bob Peabody was a nice field. It was much better than where Jimmy Colton was flying on the North Road. You might wonder why I never went up there. But the field was small, and it was kind of cramped, and of course they probably didn't want competition, and I never really asked them about going up there either. Wasn't too enthusiastic about it, I guess, myself. So I made arrangements with Bob Peabody to rent that field for $10 a month. That's $120 a year. Well, that rent come pretty hard at some months, and George helped me out a little bit on a number of occasions, I know. But anyway, we made out okay for a while, for a few days, let's say. Because I got home there, when was it? Well, around the 10th or 11th, I guess it was, of June that I got back into Halton. And I flew around, flew some passengers and so forth, some of the boys and whatnot. Had a real good time there until on the 18th of June, I took off with a couple of fellas and took off to the south going toward the railroad tracks. And gee, I just got up about 40 feet and the old engine, she quit on me. And down I came, landed on one right wheel on the same, still within the same field, and bent the propeller, pushed the landing gear up through the right wing, and did considerable damage. And I'm telling you, my stock was pretty low. I felt pretty awful about that. Of course, Jimmy Colton and all the other people come out to watch and see the aircraft. They'd heard about the damage on it. And what had happened there, strange as it may seem, I run out of gas. And the reason that I did that, it was I still had 25 gallons in the wing tank that hadn't been used. And there was about 5 or 6 shut-off valves down on the floor by my right foot to drain the wing tank into the main fuselage tank, and then they had a reserve tank also. And I had measured it with the yardstick, and I found out that there was about 6 or 7 inches of gasoline in that main tank. But I never really knew that there was a standpipe in there, and all the reserve tank was a standpipe sticking up there, 6 or 7 inches, and it gave you 15 or 20 minutes more flying time. Well, of course, I thought I had gasoline in that main tank, but I didn't, and I didn't realize quick enough to reach down and shut off turn on the wing tank and so forth, because that all happened very quickly. So that's what happened anyway. And as a result of that, of course, I had to make a report and file that to the, well, it wasn't the FAA, let me see, what was it? Well, I think it was under the Department of Transportation, something of that nature, I forget anyway, but the main chap there was Mr. Hoyt, R.D. Hoyt, in Boston, Mass. That's the only inspector we had in this area for New England. He had New Hampshire, Massachusetts, and Vermont, and Maine. So I had to write a letter to him and tell him about it, and meanwhile he'd heard about this downwind landing at Portland, and also about running into the bushes in Waterville, and now this accident. And I'm telling you, he began to say, this fellow's going to kill himself. So when he replied, he said that in view of conditions with a limited commercial license and so forth, he would take my license, suspend it for a period of 3 months. And he wanted to give me a flight check before I flew any passengers again. So that was that. Of course, that didn't help my ego any. And meantime, we had to get the aircraft fixed. Poor father. And of course, you know, at that time of life, airplanes were just beginning in good shape. They couldn't see what they was going to do. People used to ask me, well, what are you going to do with this? Anyway, how are you going to make some money and make a living and so forth? Well, we could carry passengers, and that's about all you could do. And to get into the game, I had to leave Holton and go someplace, which I didn't relish right there at that time anyway. Yes, as I say, poor father. He'd spent some money on the aviation school, and he spent some money buying the aircraft. Now it was smashed up. And all he could look forward to, I would imagine, but he never said anything. All he could think of was, all this money is on the outgo. When am I going to ever see any returns of it? Is there any hope for it? I'm telling you, he had a lot of faith in the good Lord. That's all I can say, and he must have believed in prayer to the nth degree. Said his prayers and asked for the best, and then trusted and had faith. Well, it worked out okay anyway, but at that particular time, he must have wondered about it. We got a hold of the outfit in Portland, or Scarborough at that particular time. I think there was a chap by the name of Pearson that was running the airport, and he come up and gave us an estimate of $300 or $400 to repair the aircraft. plus the trucking expenses. The wings had to be taken off and had to be put on a truck and so forth. The propeller had to be straightened out and shipped down to Portland, which was done. And they started working on the aircraft. Now that was about the last of June. I think it's a week or two before we got that on the truck, something of that nature. So July went by and I didn't hear much from him. 1st of August, I think Father and Mother and I took one of our cars, one of his car rather, in Essex, and drove down to Kittery Point to visit Lily Brackett. And in so doing, of course, we stopped at the airport to see how things were coming along with the aircraft. I well remember of walking into that hangar, and the aircraft was just the way it was unloaded from when they took it off a truck. Not a single thing had been done. Well, I'm telling you, I stepped around and snapped my fingers and asked them what was going on, and finally they said, well, we got the estimate we gave is too low. It's going to be $600. Well, that was kind of a shock. So they said that they'd be at it right away anyway, and they did get started on it, and it got, I think they got it finished, let me see, in September, the 26th of September. And before they got it finished, I left home and went back down to Portland, out to the Scarborough Airport, and I stayed out there for about 2 or 3 weeks at the final finish of when the airplane was being finished. And they had to redope the fuselage and some of the wings, and they did quite a job. I think the fuselage was twisted a little bit on it. That's what caused the increase in the estimate from 300 to 600 is one of the things anyway. So while we were there, incidentally, while I was living down there and was working there, this aircraft come in and landed, and I went out to give it gas. I pumped the gas to it, and the fellow climbed out. Of course, people at that time used to tell me that I looked like Lindbergh, had a resemblance. I was 6'1", weighed about 140 pounds, and the young fellow and so forth, combed my hair the same way he did, etc. And this chap stepped out, and I thought, my soul, if they think I look like Lindbergh, they ought to see this fellow. Well, I looked at him and pumped some gas in there, and he get out and grinned, walked around, one thing or other. Well, pretty soon Trox will come out, and 2 or 3 of the others, and they talk with him. And I said to Trox, I said, "Is this Lindbergh here?" He said, "Yeah, this is Charles Lindbergh." And he had his wife with him, and he was on the way to Vinyl Haven. They had a camp up in the cottage in Vinyl Haven, and he come in with a Kinner bird, a Kinner engine bird airplane. And I run in and got my camera. And I've got those pictures in my album today that I took of him down there at the airport. And it was quite a thrill. And he come in 2 or 3 times after that. And one time he come in and flew a new Travel Air that a chap by the name of Breckenridge had got. And he was a senator down in, a senator or a congressman, I don't know which, down in Washington. And Lindbergh come in and get into that aircraft, and he flew, did stunts and loops and rolls and snap rolls and so forth over the airport. And we saw that. There was no audience at all. I don't believe there was probably 8 or 10 people on the sideline of the airport sitting in their car. They didn't even know it was Lindbergh. But that was one of the experiences that I always treasured. Kind of tough there. The old wind used to howl around there at night, and I slept in the fellow's bed. He'd get killed. Just before I went down there, he was taken off in a Gypsy Moth at where the Portland Airport is now, and that was a farm belonging to Strange. That was Beth Strange's father's farm, and he was a doctor, and he took off there with a moth, and he didn't make it, and the moth went off the runway and upset, and he got burned to death. Well, I knew about that, of course. Heard about it and a lot of talking. And he used to fly out of Scarborough Airport. And, of course, he lived there in this little building. And that's where I lived. And his clothes were all hanging there and so forth. I didn't really like that too much. And then when it got dark, and it was raining, and the old hangar doors were banging back and forth. And when they would bang, it would echo just like a drum on the hangar. Well, after a few nights of that, I got a rollaway cot they had there somewhere, and I put that thing into the terminal. It was a pretty small terminal anyway, and I slept in there. But things was pretty tough when I was down there too. I didn't have much money, you know, and I didn't want to ask for any more. I'd asked for enough. I was so embarrassed. And I'd buy a loaf of bread, and I'd buy some bologna and a bottle of molasses, and walk back and forth into town. And that was quite a ways too. And I did that on 2 or 3 occasions, and lived that way. And then there was a chap over in Westbrook by the name of Phil. Let me see. Well, it doesn't make any difference anyway. And he was at the University of Maine with me, and I called him up, and I went out to his house and stayed 3 or 4 nights. And he had an old Model T Ford there, and he let me drive back and forth the airport with that for a few nights. But you know, I never relished it over at his place because they had bed bugs, and every darn night those darn things would eat me alive. I'd get up in the morning and I'd have 15 or 20 bites on me, and they'd itch all day. So I kind of drew an end to that after 2 or 3 days. The only thing was I got my breakfast for nothing. I didn't have to pay that, and that was pretty good. Oh dear. So the old aircraft, she got fixed around the 26th of September, and Sam Chandler was then running the airport instead of Pearson. Pearson had gotten through by that time, and Sam was running the airport, and I took a little duel from him. Later on, Sam was number 2 or 3 pilot with Boston Maine Airways, and I was very well acquainted with him and so forth. We often spoke about it. And I flew home on the 8th of October, 1932, and flew a few passengers around locally and so forth, and off and on. And I flew the aircraft until December the 2nd, and then I put it up. Meantime, of course, we talked about a hangar. So Father got George McNair, and they built a hangar to put that thing in with swinging doors and so forth. Only the doors swung upward. And I think it was $200 or $300 it cost for that hangar at that time, which was pretty good money. So we was able to have the airplane under cover and put it in. I took and painted the top of the building of the hangar. I had a windsock on it, and I painted Holton on there and so forth. And we went kind of settled in for the winter at that time. Well, there was a chap flew out of Caribou by the name of Skip Tybert. He had a Gypsy Moth. He came down to Holton on the 25th of April in 1933, and I picked up a little dual check time from him at that time in the Travel Air. I only had about 60 hours then, 62 hours, I guess. And I also got some time in his Gypsy Moth. It was NC923M, I think. So we flew during the year of 1933, giving passenger rides and practicing landings. I took Ralph Porter up and Hillis Cunliffe, gave them some dual time. I went over and landed at Jimmy Colton's field at one time. And let me see now. I went over to Patton also. Skip Tybert's wife come down to Holton, wanted to know if I'd fly her down to Mattawamkeag in his aircraft. He was in flying fishermen in from Chimney Pond with a Robin seaplane. So I said sure, so we drove over to Patton, she and I, and we get into the Gypsy Moth and flew down to Mattawamkeag, and I had no trouble landing in a little small field down there. And we walked into the camp, probably 2 miles from where we landed, or 3 miles, through the woods into the camp on the edge of a lake and stream and so forth, and she wanted to put away some outboard motors and turn over some boats, which we did. And we stayed there all night. Had supper and stayed there and left the next morning and come back to Patton. And I drove her up to Caribou, I guess I did. I flew her to Caribou and then brought the airplane back to Patton. That's the way that was, and drove my car home. Oh, and there was all kinds of little items like that, you know, normal things that would take place while you were flying. I can't relate them all. I got my logbook here in my hand. Anybody's interested, they can look at the logbook. And in September of 1933, I might say that I had to fly to Scarborough for inspection of the aircraft. Hoyt was going to be up there. And at that time, Elizabeth Fitzpatrick, Anna Fitzpatrick's sister, had entered the convent and was in here at Portland. And of course, I became acquainted with Anna about this time because I think in 1932, Anna started working for George Cumming, my brother, in Orono. He was going to summer school down there, and she got a job, I guess, probably through Pauline and Johnny Fitzpatrick, to get down and help Fern, Georgie's wife, take care of the kids and do a little housework and so forth. So George, of course, lived right straight across the street from us at that time. And so we become well acquainted with Anna at that time, and in the fall of '33, we asked her and Anthony if they would like to fly down to Scarborough with us, and we could get a plane and get a taxi and go into Portland and so forth, and she could visit with Elizabeth. And they accepted. We flew down all right, although the weather was getting pretty crummy when we get down to Portland. I was right down below the clouds, about 500 feet, raining and so forth. We landed at Scarborough and we got the aircraft inspected, but the weather socked in for about 2 days before we get back to Halton. So that was one little incident. And during that time of 1933, Anna, let me see, this was in 33, of course. She and then she stayed with George that winter of 32. Stayed with George and Fern, and 33 was her senior year in high school. And she lived right straight across the road from where I lived, of course. George lived there, and she stayed there. So we become quite well acquainted at that time. And that's one of the reasons that we asked her to fly down to Portland. And let me see. I gave Ralph Porter some dual time. I gave Hillis Cunliffe some dual time instructions and so forth. And George and I flew up to visit school in the wintertime of 33 and 34. And we landed up there in the in the field, right alongside of the schoolhouse up in Littleton Ridge. And darn it, I broke the ski off on the airplane. I put it on skis in between time. We got some skis built, homemade ones, made up to Presque Isle, and they cost $25. And they work pretty slick, too. They had bungee cord on the front of them and safety wire, so forth, cable to hold them up there in case the cord broke and whatnot. The only thing is that the aircraft was so darn heavy, if it set too long in one spot on the snow, you could never get it started. You'd have to get out and twist it and bang it back and forth and so forth. So we had a few experiences like that. Now I'll just break off the aircraft flying here for a moment and kind of regress to 1930, 33, 32, and 33. I think it was in the fall of 32 that I got a job with the Halton Water Company. It seems like ERA come in. No, let me see. NRA come in. And it was to put more people to work and so forth. And I got a job over to the pumping station. There was 3 men over there working 8-hour shifts, 24 hours a day. And they wanted to make room for another man, so they decided that 4 men should work 6 hours a day. So Father, through his efforts and so forth, got me a job over at the electrical pumping station there, where they controlled the street lights and pump the water for the reservoir, drinking water for the town, and where the circuits from the different the electric company from up in Presque Isle and from Aroostook Falls come in and so forth. And we had problems. I had to do the switching, etc. And I got $15 a week working there. Well, Anna and I became a little bit more friendly and started going out a few places and driving around together, of course. And in May, her birthday is in the 19th of May of 1934, we became engaged. And she learned to drive the little Ford runabout that I had there, and took that for a few little trips around the town and did some things and so forth. And as a result, we got married on July 23rd in 1934. But that was quite a transition from both of us. And that's a story in itself again, because her family was Catholics and my family was Protestant, Baptist, and so forth. And at that time and vintage and so forth, why, things were pretty tough as far as recognize each religion and so forth, and there was quite a bit of animosity between some. But I must say her folks, her father and mother, were wonderful true Christians, as well as mine were. They never complained or upset things at all, and were always just as good and kind and interested with us and so forth. So it made it much easier. We got married on the in the priest's house. I didn't become a Catholic at that time. And we went on our honeymoon down through the Old Orchard and so forth, and on our little Ford, I think that was a 1927 Ford Coupe. We drove down to Lewiston, visited Galen and Mary Vale, and whom we knew from Holton. He was a school teacher and had moved down to Lewiston. And we come back up through the White Mountains and really had an enjoyable 5 or 6 days vacation. And I asked Bert McIntyre for a raise about that time. I said I was getting married, I'd like to have a little more money. So he come across with $1 a week. I went from $15 a week to $16 a week. And continued to work there at the pumping station, and Anna and I rented a house up on High Street from Lou Powers. And we got the rent for $12 a month. That was the upstairs flat. And it was right up over Peter Dombeck. Pete Dombeck had come up from New York in 1927 to help run the radio receiving station from England. They set up the communication system there in Holton, had big antennas and so forth. And while he was there, he got married to Louise Britton, and they had 3 children when we lived there. There was twins were born, and Dolly was there also. And I remember I had some stamps from grandfather's collection, I guess. I don't know really where they come from. I had them anyway in a book. And this Lou Powers was a great collector of stamps. And he wanted to look over the book. Said he'd arrange them all. Well, I sent them over with him, you know. And he kept 2 or 3 stamps, he said, and he would pay me 1 month's rent. So I got $12 out of a few stamps, but Lord knows how much they were worth. They could have been worth a couple of $100 at that time, and I wouldn't know one stamp from another, you know. But anyway, I got a month's rent free and got the rest of my stamps put back and in the book and in order. I later gave those stamps to McNutt, Oral McNutt, because he was quite a stamp collector. Well, we continued to fly off and on there through a year of 1933. And along in the fall of 33, I went down, I asked Anna, she and I was going out occasionally and so forth. I asked her and Anthony if they'd like to fly down to Portland, to the old Scarborough Airport, because I had to have the aircraft inspected. And I think it was in September. And of course Elizabeth, Anna's sister, was in the convent down to Portland, and it would be nice for them to fly down and visit her, and I expected to go down and right back the same day. Well, we left in the morning and got started and made out quite well until we got down around Augusta, between Augusta and Brunswick, and the ceiling began to lower. And by the time we got to Brunswick, it was I was down to 400 or 500 feet. just flying underneath the clouds, and it was beginning to drizzle, and a little fog was coming in and so forth. And I wasn't quite sure just how I was going to get out to that airport at that time. And I, of course, open cockpit, with helmet and goggles on and so forth. A little bit of rain on your glasses. You wipe them off with your sleeve, and everything became a little bit more foggy than it was. But I kind of kept to the left there, and I get out around Cape Elizabeth, I think. And I see the lighthouse there, and then I went back to the railroad track. I turned right and back into the west there a little bit. Of course, the compass wasn't still operating. And picked up that railroad track and followed that down. And I come onto the road, and I recognize the road, and we get into the Scarborough Airport all okay, without any further trouble. And we got the aircraft inspected, and the weather deteriorated very rapidly after that. Fog come in and come right down to 0-0. Well, I think they went in and visited with their sister Elizabeth, and I think I stayed at the airport while the inspection was going on. And at that time, the inspector, Robert Hoyt, come up from Boston, and he'd walk around the aircraft with a little knife, and he'd take and cut that fabric on the wings at different locations where the struts would hitch on and so forth, and take a look at the spars. Of course, the spars were wood. See if there was any dry rot or whatnot in there. And then, of course, you had to take and sew those up with a baseball stitch and put a patch over them and dope it and so forth. And had that done at the airport, one of the mechanics there. So that's what we was doing while they were visiting. We passed the inspection all okay and ready to go home, but couldn't fly on account of the weather being bad. So we got a taxi, I guess, or somebody from the airport took us up to an overnight cabin. It was all cabins. There wasn't motels in. And we got a couple of cabins, and we stayed there all night. And I think we stayed there the next day, too. And the weather was still pretty darn crummy. And we returned home anyway, got back into Halton without any further problems within the next day, except it took us a little longer. Then I had another trip. I wanted to fly up to Washburn, I know, long about that time. It might have been a little bit later. It might have been the spring of the following year in 34, early 34. I'm not just quite sure. But speaking of 1934, we got our skis in January the 13th of 1934. I had a fellow making skis up in Presque Isle for aircraft. And we ordered a pair, and they were $25. And I think that was $25 a pair. I'm not quite sure of that. It might have been $25 a piece. But anyway, we got the skis, and seemed like quite an exorbitant price. And we put them on the aircraft, and so we flew a little bit that winter. And I used to walk out to the airport. Of course, it was out there in Carey's Mills. And the shortest way to get out there in walking was to go on the railroad track. We'd go over to the station and walk across the bridge out by the yard and walk up to the Carey's Mills and then take the road where the railroad track crossed the road there into the airport. Open the hangar doors, and we used to have to shovel snow to get it underneath the skis because it was dry and bare inside the hangar, so that the skis would slip pretty good. And then lift and tug and push and get that thing out just far enough so that we could put a plumber's pot underneath the engine. That was a gasoline pot burned with a fierce flame and hot. And we put a canvas over the engine to keep the heat in and burn that pot until it got nice and warm. We had to drain the oil too, and we'd heat the oil separately and then pour it into the tank. There's about 5 gallons of oil. You work there for a half a day getting that thing ready to start. And then you go out and try to start it. And this had a direct type of an arrangement between a crank on the side of the aircraft and the engine and the propeller, so that you could crank and the propeller would turn over quite slowly. It wasn't an inertia starter. It was one that was kind of a direct job. Well, I've cranked my heart out, and it would give